When Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine in 2022, he thought he'd achieve victory and install a puppet regime in Kiev in 2 to 3 days. That didn't go to plan, and the war is costing Russia more now than it ever has. The economy is struggling, the brain drain is drastic, and it has galvanized and increased the size of NATO with 2 of Europe's key military players. In this episode, we'll look at how Sweden is likely the biggest threat to Vladimir Putin's ambitions for a new Russian empire, and why Sweden is the piece that shores up the new Nordic powerhouse bloc within NATO. Sweden broke its long-standing neutrality and applied for NATO membership in May 2022, just a few months after Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. While Finland had a more recent memory of being invaded by Russia in the Winter War, Sweden hadn't felt the need to break their neutrality since 1814. While it doesn't come as a shock, Vladimir Putin quickly reacted in his usual manner with threats of nuclear escalation, and that he'd place nuclear weapons closer to Sweden and Finland. In reality though, most analysts agree that Putin had these weapons in Kaliningrad already, so it doesn't constitute a change, other than a PR opportunity for Putin to saber-rattle with his nukes. While Putin worked hard to deflect the internal audience away from why Sweden and Finland joined NATO, the Kremlin must have realized at some point what a mistake the war in Ukraine was to them. With Finland and Sweden joining NATO, the Baltic Sea is now essentially a NATO lake, and in it, NATO will have some of the most advanced Swedish-made equipment, including the terrifyingly silent submarines that Sweden is so famous for, an incredible air force, and a military which is on the rise. While the people most friendly to Putin within NATO long tried to hold up Sweden's ascension, there was only so much Erdogan and Orbán could do when faced with pressure from the collective West. On March 7, 2024, Sweden entered the alliance as its 32nd member. Many critics within NATO have complained that it has, in the past, added members who bring little to the table. That is definitely not true for Sweden. So what does Sweden bring? First of all, there's the geographic advantage that comes with Swedish territory. While Russia could count on almost half of the Baltic belonging to non-NATO countries before 2022, it's now alone in a sea pretty much controlled by NATO. Sweden's Gotland Island is only 250 kilometers north of Kaliningrad, and on it, Sweden has big plans and is remilitarizing massively. Swedish radars, known for their extremely advanced nature, will easily be able to pour tons of data on Russia's activity into NATO's data points every single minute. Secondly, militarily, Sweden joining NATO helps plug a gap that we've been talking about within the alliance for a long time, namely the Suwalki Gap. While Putin could try to isolate the Baltic states before 2022, it is now nigh on impossible to avoid Sweden and Norway, both reinforcing and supplying the Baltics, if Russia tried to exploit this possibility. The ship lanes between the Baltic states and Sweden are too hard for Russia to contest, as Sweden would bring to bear its state-of-the-art navy and anti-ship capability. The same can be said about the geographical situation between the Nordic countries. Sweden was the last piece of the puzzle that makes for a land corridor between Finland and Norway, and it also enables quick transport over the Danish bridges to mainland Sweden of quick reaction forces, supplies and equipment if Finland or Norway were to be attacked. It's been a bit of a trend for a while to discredit Sweden's military might, and while some of that may have a root in reality, due to a continued build-down of the Swedish armed forces, it is still one of Europe's by far most technologically advanced armed forces. Sweden only spent 1% of their GDP on defense in 2018, but is now aiming to be over 2% by the end of 2024. As I've discussed in my previous videos on Swedish military technology, Sweden's by far largest asset is its military industry and technology. Sweden brings items to the fray, which are generally top of the line in everything they do. In example, the CV-90, Stridsvagn 122 and 123, Archer artillery, modern surveillance aircraft, and fighter jets. To get a better understanding of the Swedish military industry, I'll leave a link to my video about this topic in the description below. Sweden's key assets have always been its air force and navy. Sweden boasts about 100 JAS39 Gripen combat aircraft and is currently working on bringing a lot of these up to the new E variant. They're famed for their low maintenance requirements, being able to take off from roads and airfields in substandard conditions, and boast some of the most advanced electronic warfare equipment on the globe. While the Gripen is only considered a fourth-generation fighter jet, the Swedish Air Force industry is considering if they should take part in or make their own sixth-generation fighter, with a decision due to be made in the coming years. Until then, the very capable Gripen will perfectly complement the F-35 and F-16 of their neighbors in Denmark, Norway and Finland, making sure that the Nordics will have over 200 modern capable fighter jets, with over half of those being the F-35. As we discussed before, Finland provides a land-based deterrent to Russian aggression in Europe, of which the alliance hasn't seen in many years. Similarly, Sweden does the same on and under the Baltic Sea. Sweden's submarine program is likely the most advanced in the world, and their current 5 active Stirling-powered submarines are so fatal and stealthy that in a simulation with the American Navy, one of Sweden's submarines managed to sneak up on an aircraft carrier group, score several hits, and get away undetected. These submarines are the perfect hunter in the Baltic Sea's many choke points and narrow waters, making them a weapon that NATO has never had before. Sweden is expected to have their next iteration of these submarines ready when they receive their first out of 2 A-26 submarines in 2027. The A-26 will have the ability to launch underwater drones on top of all the other extremely advanced technology, which makes Swedish submarines some of the best in the world. It doesn't just stop there for Sweden's Navy. They've also got 5 top-of-the-line corvettes, called the Visby class, who are famed for their extremely stealthy operations and deadly missile payload. Sweden is also building 4 more hyper-modern corvettes, expected to be ready around 2030. In short, what Sweden brings to NATO's Baltic Sea operations is expertise in operating in an environment NATO have struggled with for years due to varying salinity levels and how shallow the waters are. It brings with it experience from operating submarines in the Baltic Sea since 1904, which is a value to all NATO naval assets in the area. The scales were already in Russia's disfavor before Sweden and Finland joined NATO. Now the total NATO naval presence in the Baltic makes Russia's Baltic fleet look like a hobby fleet. Putin must be angered by losing access to yet another world waterway. However, as I have been an army grunt for my whole adult life, it would be amiss for me not to mention the strides Sweden is making on land too. For years, my Swedish colleagues have been underfunded, been short-staffed, and generally lacked numbers. But now, with Putin being so aggressive in Ukraine, the Swedish parliament have once again decided to spend on the army, pledging to increase the active personnel by 30,000 soldiers. Sweden is in a much better position than many of its NATO allies when it comes to rearming, mainly due to having produced most of the equipment and arms they needed themselves in its long neutral period. This armed neutrality enables Sweden to produce a large part of what it will need to reach its military goals, while others, like in example Denmark, will need to import equipment from elsewhere. The added benefit for NATO is that Swedish military production can also help the states around them rearm with top-of-the-line products like the Archer, JAS39, CV90, and various forms of ammunition. To conclude, Russia's violation of international law when it came to Ukraine has made sure that the Nordic region of NATO is safer than it ever was. Sweden adds capability that NATO never had in the Baltic. It connects many NATO powers through land bridges, and it can serve as a vital lifeline for the Baltic states and Finland in the event of Russia deciding they also want to go after these states. All in all, Sweden has checked Putin's ambitions more than any other nation has in the last 30 years, except for Ukraine. The easy victory Putin hoped to achieve in Ukraine has brought on board 2 nations in Europe who have great historical memories of wars with Russia. Sweden is one of the few nations to have occupied Moscow, and I'm pretty sure Putin knows full well that he's angered someone he shouldn't have angered. Before you go, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and like this video. It helps my channel compete with much larger fish. As always, I'd love to hear your feedback, so let me know in the comments what you thought about this video. Have a good day wherever you are.